Speaking of what cannot be not addressed,
I
we're
did
here
that
on
on
October
purpose.
14th, 2023, exactly 1 week after October 7th, which was the day just a week ago on which the Hamas terrorist organization launched a historically unprecedented, massive assault against civilian targets in the south of Israel, killing many hundreds, kidnapping, mutilating, desecrating, slaughtering men, women, children, elderly, etc. I could go on. I think everybody in earshot knows what I'm talking about. And I just feel like we probably ought to close our conversation out here today. None of us are necessarily experts on this particular subject matter in foreign policy, but we are citizens of this country and of the world with some commentary about these events. John?
I have been very struck by a lot of the social media commentary from the left about this particular thing that Hamas did. And I've also been impressed by how many of them have pedaled it back in view partly of how truly horrific the data has come to be, and then also for the less admirable reason of just not wanting to be roasted on social media for heartlessness. But the idea that Hamas was justified in the extent of what they did, not just a few missiles, I hate to say not just a few people murdered, but that was justifiable because they are the oppressed rather than the oppressor in this situation. What I see is a laziness among a certain kind of thinker on the hard left. And that's basically that the world is about white people and black people, white of various kinds and black of various kinds. And Hamas and the Palestinians in this case are seen as the black people, and the Jews are seen as the white people. And the idea is that you can do anything, that anything is justified in order to get the quote unquote white person's boots off of your neck, including what Hamas has done here. And I completely understand that Israel has blood on its hands as well. But Hamas started this one and in such an extreme way. And yet there are people who would actually sit there and applaud that kind of butchery, including people who Hamas themselves would have nothing but disgust for and might even consider interfering with their being living people. For anybody who's gay to cheer on Hamas because they're coming from the left, for example, how long would they last in Gaza? What kind of life would they have led? And that goes for a lot of other people, including people who are not men. Just the idea that they are heroes. I find it lazy. I find it lazy as, Glenn, you'll get this one, cheering the rioters on in 2020 because people tearing down their own neighborhoods because of George Floyd. Because they're black, it's okay to tear down your own neighborhood. And you see this sort of thing again and again, this idea that if the person is oppressed, then it's okay for them to do things that would chill you to your socks if you saw the oppressor doing it, even if the oppressor was doing it much, much less. And it's disturbing because it's condescending. Basically, you're saying that Hamas, having no responsibility for their actions, oppression has made them less than fully human and beyond responsibility. And because Black Americans are seen that way so often in so many situations, it irritates me. The idea that an educated person in particular would look at what happened even with the rave and think, yay, hooray. I'm utterly disgusted because those people think they're ahead of the curve. They think that they're the enlightened ones, but no, they're in the dark. It's awful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if you saw this tweet going around. It was like, what did y'all think decolonization meant? Vibes?
That was the first one that got me. Yeah.
So the idea is like that's literally just a full excusing of slaughtering civilians on account of the goal being decolonization. Now, this gets to one of the deepest and I think most important questions when you're looking at this conflict or any conflict, which is what are the actual end goals of each side? I was thinking about this the other day. When we think about World War II, nobody says what a horrible war. I'm thinking about the innocent loss of life on both sides. And that would be an appropriate reaction, but it's not how we tend to think about World War II. We tend to think, thank God the Allies beat the Nazis and prevented them from building a genocidal empire. In other words, we think about the goals of each side of the conflict, knowing that waging war entails terrible, terrible things in general. If you ask what really are the end goals of Hamas and what are the end goals of Israel, I think you come to two very different visions. Right? I think that Hamas wants to do what it did on October 7th, ideally, to every Jew in Israel, eradicate them by any means necessary, and then establish a Palestinian Islamic State over the whole land. I think that is their goal.
And one clue that you're correct is that they say so.
Yes, and they're quite explicit about that in their charter. And it makes sense of all their behavior, including their behavior towards their own people. Now, on the other hand, what does Israel want? Or I'm sure if you ask the settlers in the West Bank, they want something different and more religious sounding than secular Israelis. But on the whole, we pretty much know what Israel wants because they have the power in the situation. Right? If they wanted what Hamas wanted, but in reverse, if they wanted to eliminate every Palestinian, every Arab, they could do that tomorrow.
They could have done it 50 years ago. Yeah.
This is Sam Harris's argument.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we should credit him because I just saw him make exactly this argument. You judge the sides by imagining what they would do if they had power. Israel has the power to kill a lot more Palestinian babies than it has in fact killed. I ask you to think about how many Jewish babies would be killed by Hamas if they had the ability to deliver that death to them. This is the argument.
You know what, though, worries me very quickly is that talk about weak thinking. If Israel goes in there and levels the whole northern half of Gaza, which it looks like as we record this, that's what they're thinking about doing, telling people to leave, and then they're just going to run it down flat. It's painfully clear that what that's going to create is another generation of bored, angry, undereducated young men who hate Israel and keep on doing this same sort of thing. I don't see how it could be different. And I wonder if Israel could consider not doing that, because I'm not sure what would be gained, except for a temporary reprieve, by bulldozing where most people in Gaza live and also inevitably killing a whole lot of people while they're doing it. I certainly understand the emotional appeal, but I don't see why that is a useful tactic. And I'm afraid that's what is coming up. Israel needs to talk about having the power. I wish they could exhibit a certain forbearance, which is maybe too much to ask. I'm not running Israel, but still.
Now, I know enough. I agree with you from an outside perspective. I know enough Israelis to know what the kind of Israeli perspective on that question might sound like. And it might sound like something like this. Everything we have tried has led to more terror. When we have tried the forbearance, in other words, they unilaterally pulled out of Gaza, which was that was a kind of a left-wing decision in a sense. Like they didn't get anything for it. They did what the pro-peace crowd wanted and just pulled out of occupied territory. And they feel what they got in response was more terror. Right? They got Hamas took over. They offered Palestinians a state in 2000, Camp David and Clinton parameters, and they feel they were rewarded by the Second Intifada, which was, similar to what happened on 10/7, but just stretched out over many years. So they feel that both the conciliatory approach has led to more terror and the tough approach has led to more terror. And I think that they were just, they would rather err on the side of absolute security because, the carrot and the stick seem to yield the same result, right? It seems like they're fighting an enemy that is just committed to their destruction no matter what they do. And I think there's a lot of Israelis that really would have been more moved by that kind of logic 20 years ago, but they feel that they've been burned by it so many times before that they have now moved to the tough, security-focused end of the spectrum.
And then the result will be these young men feeling like they're living in a cage, gradually rebuilding Gaza, but with their whole identities based on hating Israel and hating Jews. In a way, and this is, I don't mean to equate the two things, but it's kind of like, this brings it into a circle. The kind of people at the TED who can't listen to you saying those perfectly sensible things because it undermines their sense of what it means to be a thinking person and what it means to matter. You're taking away part of their essence. Much, much worse here. All they've got, they've got no education, no employment, no employment possibilities. And so their whole selves are going to be about avenging 2023. That's what happens to human beings when they don't have enough to hold on to. I don't know what the answer is, but yeah.
Let me say a couple of things. I mean, one thing that occurs to me right away is Hamas is not the Palestinian people. It is Hamas. It's a terror organization. It's an Islamist organization. It is what it is. So those people here in the United States who have sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians, and I'm one of them, need to be very clear about the nature of that organization and the moral clarity to be able to see barbarism and terror for what it is need not come at the expense of being able to sympathize with the historical disaster for Palestinian Arabs, which the creation of the state of Israel, for many of them, has led to. It seems to me no need to choose between those two things. The other thing I want to say is it's just been flabbergasted by the tepid, equivocating, timid responses of some people, like presidents of universities like the one that I work for, who, when George Floyd got killed in Minneapolis and some people were running around burning down neighborhoods in cities around the country, were able to speak with great clarity and specificity about the moral wrong that was at stake. So, for example, Claudine Gay, president of Harvard University, has come under considerable pressure and has had to back and fill and issue multiple statements after some student organizations basically said Israel was responsible for everything that Hamas wrought on October 7th. And some observers, powerful associates of Harvard University, alumni, the former president, Lawrence Summers of the university and so forth, castigated the leadership of the university for allowing those statements to go unanswered by the front office, the administrative leadership of the university, to the effect that those people can say what they want, but they don't speak for Harvard. Here's what we think about that. And only after cajoling and public embarrassment were a more refined condemnation of the terror to be heard forthcoming from Harvard's administration. And they are not alone in this. So I don't know, it strikes me as an interesting moment here where a lot of stuff is getting laid bare. Antifa is supposed to be an anti-fascist organization. What Hamas wrought in southern Israel could, I think, not unreasonably be likened to a pogrom against Jews fueled by anti-Semitism and bearing no small resemblance to what happened in Europe in the Second World War. I haven't heard the anti-fascists who are running around talking about Donald Trump denouncing the anti-Semitism of the Hamas movement.
Because they think of Hamas as the black people. Yeah.
The anti-colonialists. And here, let me go one step further. Civilization versus barbarism. The West, order, enlightenment, human rights, abolition, freedom, versus the Dark Ages. Are we seeing graphically being played out before our eyes the necessity to make a choice? Where do you stand? Do you stand with the forces who would undermine and tear down the achievements of the last 300 years? Where Israel stands with those achievements? Or do you take your postmodern, post-critical theory, post-colonial ideological views to the point of being able to look askance at the murder of hundreds of people in the name of fascist ideas? You choose.
Yeah, I want to underscore one thing you said, the difference between Hamas and the Palestinian people. Obviously, Hamas was elected and they're way more popular than you would hope, unfortunately, with Palestinians. On the other hand, they're quite clear about the fact that they do not care whether their own people live or die. Because and they say this out loud, because in their ideology, which is extremist and religious, they actually believe each Palestinian that dies in their effort to fight Israel goes straight to heaven. So when Israel right now is telling, or yesterday told 1 million Gazans to go south, which is, of course, really impractical and probably an absolute humanitarian disaster. Hamas told them to stay put, because Hamas, it actually doesn't seem to move them whether Palestinian civilians died, because they appear to be true believers. They appear to believe all of those children killed by Israeli bombs go straight to heaven. And so there's no cognitive dissonance when they hide their headquarters underneath a hospital, or they shoot rockets from a mosque. This is a mindset that can't be compromised with.
We get near the end, but I just want to mention, I read this piece in The Atlantic this morning by George Packer, who says, let's remember 9/11 as we think about October 7th being Israel's 9/11. And let's remember the disaster that ensued for the United States and for the world when we reacted as we did to the tragedy of 9/11. First by invading Afghanistan, and we were there forever until we left ignominiously, but more fundamentally by invading and deposing Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which I think we can now acknowledge in retrospect wasn't exactly the smartest move. President George W. Bush with a bullhorn standing on the rubble of the World Trade Center saying, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, is one thing. Overreaction and living with the consequences of your bellicose overreaction to your own victimization for decades at the expense of trillions is another. Israel, be careful. This is George Packer on my reprise. What do you think?
It's important. And
yeah,
the whole
I think
the barbarism point, Glenn. See, there's so many people among us who would say that the barbarism is okay if it's the oppressed, that there's nothing else they could do, and at least the barbarism is striking against the colonization coming from a whiteness that needs to be questioned. And so for them, it's that paradigm. So it's not barbarism, it's a necessary kind of authenticity and a punch against predatory imperial whiteness. For them, that's the paradigm. And so they would choose the barbarism. And, they say things, they cluck, well, it's unfortunate, etc. But for them, it's almost a Hegelian thing, I get the feeling. That's the way history has to proceed. That's a hard thing to cut through. I mean, maybe I'm just getting too upset about a certain kind of person who is in the commentariat. I mean, what really matters is the lives of the people on that little piece of land. But yeah.
The Gulag Archipelago, Stalin. Cambodia, Kampuchea, Pol Pot. How many starved to death in China? I mean, liberal values actually have something going for them in terms of the creation of political circumstances that allow for human flourishing. And the opposite of liberal values have consequences that can be measured in millions of lives. This is not nothing. This is, as they say, a moment of truth.
And the last thing I'll say is I think the direction Israeli politics is going in more and more to the right, not just because of this incident, but prior to it, partly as a result of just the demographics of the country. The ultra-Orthodox used to be a tiny minority, and now it's like a third of Israeli children under a certain age are ultra-Orthodox, who tend to be, pro-settling the West Bank, pro-expanding those settlements for religious reasons. It appears to be a very, very grim situation to me, because a huge opportunity was missed in 2000. That's the closest they ever came to a two-state solution. And the Israeli public has only gotten more, gone more to the right since then. The Palestinian public has been rejectionist throughout. And so I think the opportunities for a real durable political solution, it's possible that they've just passed us by permanently. And this is something that will only be resolved through violence for the foreseeable future, which is it could get worse, sad to contemplate.
Yep.
Yeah. I went on one of those expeditions of American journalists and intellectuals to Israel a few years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And met with people all over the place, and politicians and journalists and professors and civic leaders and whatnot. Spent some time in Ramallah and talked with Palestinian leadership there, PLO leadership there. And I came away, this was maybe 3 years ago, thinking, my God, the two-state solution is just not going to happen from either side. We're going for creeping annexation on the West Bank, and I don't know what the hell you do with Gaza. That's 2 million people, 2.5 million people sitting there. And I thought the unspeakable thought that the Zionist movement, culminating in the establishment of the state of Israel, in many ways a triumph for human values, has also been a great tragedy, producing a situation that could go on for another 75 years of awful conflict and cycles of violence and recrimination and whatnot. And that's just tragic. I'm not an expert here, not by any means. I don't see a way out.
Oh, we should mention something. I can feel it coming, because you mentioned the settlements. They're not central to the current events here. But there's some people who are going to think that, based on the discussion we've just had, that we need to be told about the settlements. I want it to be clear, folks, that we know. And I have often questioned Israelis about settlements and keeping on doing it, and what the other side of the argument is supposed to be on that. And so I don't think we've had this discussion not knowing about the issue of the settlements. Somebody actually would write us and say, did you know? Yes, folks, we did know.
Well, that was implicit in what I was just saying. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I don't see a way out, because right. I was at Gush Etzion, which is one of the quote settlements in the disputed, not occupied territories, is the way they referred to it. Those people are dug in. Mm-hmm. They're not going anywhere.
It's their home. It is in their minds.
At last, they are home at last.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've seen terrible videos of them throwing rocks at Palestinians and so forth, and it's a very difficult issue, especially for the secular Israeli public that doesn't quite feel the religious attachment to that land. They don't necessarily think it's biblically owed to them, but they struggle to criticize the settlers and the settlements the way an outsider can easily do, because they still feel in some ways they're people, and it's a very difficult issue for them, and also they don't want to compromise and give the impression that the settlements are the reason for the terrorism. They will tell you the terrorism has been happening continuously regardless of what goes on, right? Regardless of whether settlements are frozen. It's been going on since before the settlements started, right? Before we occupied the West Bank. So I think they're right to draw a distinction that the settlements are not, Hamas is not going to stop trying to murder Israelis if they roll back the settlements, right? It's fundamentally a rejectionist and genocidal movement on the part of the terrorists. Nevertheless, the settlements I don't think they're defensible from a secular point of view. If you don't share the religious attachment to the land, I'm not sure you can really defend the expansion of settlements, and I would never be tempted to.
Okay, well, here we are, way out over our skis on probably the most intractable political conflict on the planet today, arguably so. And we're not experts. I'll say it again, but we are citizens and we are moral beings, and we have to speak to these matters, and so we've done. Thank you, Coleman, for coming on the Glenn Show with John McWhorter, and good luck with the book.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.